We have Greg Mikkelson with us, who is going to talk to us about degrowth, which is pretty relevant to our platform. Kind of a little bit of a backstory, I guess I could give is that when we were developing the policy book, um, we had a lot of debates on degrowth and whether or not it was something that we wanted to include in the platform. Some people say it's not a socialist concept. A lot of people who are more concerned about the environment says it's absolutely essential and something that we should be striving for first. Um, it's also become kind of like a right-wing term to denounce the left because it doesn't really, I don't know, it's like not really a good term. Like when you hear degrowth, like it sounds like you just want to stop all jobs and you don't care about workers and obviously if you don't know the context behind it, it doesn't sound very good from a worker's perspective. So we even actually had many debates on it on our team and have redone a lot of our communications because they would have the word degrowth on it, and we just don't think that it's going to be received well by the broader public. So, yeah, it's something that we remove from our platform, but the concept is in our platform, just not the word. So, yeah, it's definitely relevant to our platform. Um, yeah, I guess I'll introduce Greg. So, Greg was a tenured prof of environmental studies. And he lectured and published in ecology, philosophy, economics, and with a focus on nature, causes, and the value of biological diversity. And he also helped divest his university from fossil fuel. He now volunteers as a researcher and organizer for a growing international movement to shut down the tar sand pipelines in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence watershed. So with that, I guess we'll welcome Greg. Hopefully you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. And in a minute, we'll see if I can successfully share my screen. Thank you, Jasmine, for the background. Also, thank you to Eve. I'm not sure he's here, but he's the one who invited me to pitch degrowth to you good people. Um, and yeah, I so the background for me was I was inspired by Eve's campaign from the very beginning, largely because he would just come out and say what needs to happen. We need to shut down the tar sands. We need to stop capitalism, and we need to degrow, because that was actually in the initial campaign video that I think maybe still on the website. And then I read the wonderful Capitalism Can't Be Fixed platform, and I noticed that it was gone. And it was replaced by something like sustainable economic growth. And then I subsequently ran into Eve at a little action that he had organized at Alexandra Bulris's office. More about trying to reform the NDP's undemocratic processes, et cetera, and trying to get sitting NDP MPs to take up the cause. Anyway, so he explained a little bit that it just wasn't very popular among the people who were putting the um, platform together, and I think it was after that I said, well, uh, maybe I think it'd be interesting to have a debate about it. And apparently there already has been debate. So this will be my contribution to it. And I invite questions and comments and, discussion. I don't have that many slides. So first of all, I'll say that if anybody has a question of clarification during the presentation, don't hesitate to ask. If it's something more substantive, maybe we can save it for the discussion afterwards. Um, so yeah, I guess one way to think about my presentation is I'm kind of making a pitch for for having degrowth as a prominent part of the program. And we'll see what you all have to say about that. Um, One other thing to say is that the talk is based on original research, such as downloading authoritative data sets and crunching numbers, but also, as you'll see, reading and thinking about the really inspiring Capitalism Can't Be Fixed platform and how it might fit with degrowth. So I'm now going to try to share my screen. Can everybody see that?
Yeah, we can see.
Excellent. And I think it must be, I'll put it into slides. Yeah. So it should be in slideshow mode now. Whoops. Okay. All right. So the main reason that we need degrowth is that, first of all economic activity depletes and pollutes nature, and growing the economy worsens those impacts. So we are now well past the point at which we need to shrink the economy. And whether degrowth is the right word, I'm not fixated on that, but we basically need to shrink the economy back to a level at which nature can regenerate the resources that we consume and assimilate all the pollution that we produce. So here is just maybe a high level kind of summary of the problem. So, for example, crunching the numbers, on average, 1% increase in gross domestic product per capita, which is the main way of measuring the size of the economy and the growth of the economy. You grow the economy by 1%, you're going to deplete and pollute nature by about 0.5% more than we've already done so. And we're already kind of unhinging ecosystems in 100 different ways: climate, biodiversity, oceanic acidification, toxic chemicals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And every 1% growth increases that by 0.5% more. And it is collapsing the biosphere. So it depopulates the 10 million species that we share the planet with by almost a full percent more. So it's almost proportional there. Um, Meanwhile, it actually does little, nothing, or worse for human well-being, despite the fact that so many people assume that it's essential for human well-being. Um, Now, whether growth does little, nothing, or worse for our well-being depends on the scale of analysis and the statistical model. But I will say that across Canadian provinces over the past 40 and more years, and after controlling for kind of idiosyncratic differences between different provinces and successive years, each $1,000 of growth actually goes along with 3 weeks less life, and that's in terms of life expectancy a year later. Um, so that's the kind of basic, very I guess schematic reason that we need degrowth. So and that's based on statistical analysis, both at the national level and at the provincial level. So let's look at a couple examples of that. Let's start at the country level. Costa Rica, actually, yeah, maybe I'll just take a minute to explain the little graph here. So on the horizontal axis is the year going back to 1970, and I think it goes through 2023 for these data. And then on the y-axis is that gross domestic product per capita, which is, basically the most common measure of how rich or poor a country is. And in this case, GDP per capita is corrected both for inflation over time and differences in purchasing power between countries. Um, so in 1970, the US started out much richer than Costa Rica, um, more than twice as rich, maybe three times as rich. And since then, it's grown faster so that, if you look at the gap between those two lines, Costa Rica in the red and United States in the blue, the gap has widened. Now, we might think that that would go along with um, the US, basically getting better and better off and doing better and better. But if we look at the leading statistic on human well-being, life expectancy is the most comprehensive measure that we have that's available at many different levels. The US also started out substantially healthier than Costa Rica, so by about, looks like almost 5 years or so. But Costa Rica, despite being much poorer and growing more slowly, overtook the US in 1984 and has surpassed it ever since. In other words, the wealth gap and the health gap between the two countries have moved in opposite directions. And in fact, the health gap has reversed. Now, here is a provincial example. So once again, oh yeah, I should have mentioned that in the previous graph, the vertical axis is different than in the first graph. So first we were looking at GDP per capita, but in the second graph we're looking at life expectancy um, in years. That's life expectancy at birth. So at the provincial level, once again, um, the vertical axis represents the monetary value of economic activity per capita. And once again, we have one society starting out richer, namely Saskatchewan, starting out not quite $10,000 richer per capita than Quebec in 1980, um, and growing faster, so that gap has widened over time. But as in the country level example, once again, we see the less rich, slower growing society overtook the faster growing one, the richer, faster growing one in terms of the most comprehensive measure of health that we have, um, measurable at different scales. So Saskatchewan started out healthier than Quebec, and economically, it was both richer and grew faster, but Quebec overtook it in 1999. And by this measure, Quebecers are now healthier than people in any other province or state in all of North America. And when I tell people that, they immediately want to know why. I think it must have something to do with the fact that Quebec has, despite many decades of austerity, et cetera, still has more robust social democracy than most other provinces and almost certainly than any state in the US, as indicated by our higher tax rate. All right, so those are a couple of examples of, basically how growth does not translate into better well-being. Um, and I focused on that contrast because I think people find it less surprising that growth is, you know, very reliably tied to ecological damage, but it's the fact that we're getting little, nothing, or actually sometimes even worse in terms of human well-being as well. So I'm arguing that we do need degrowth. But what is degrowth? Here's how the Degrowth Institute, which has gotten going just in the last couple of years in Chicago, defines it. And that is as an intentional downscaling of the global economy for the purpose of achieving ecological sustainability and social justice. And I will argue that degrowth is actually implied by many policies that you all have already committed to via the Capitalism Can't Be Fixed platform, which would be a fantastic start in terms of degrowth. But Canada actually has to go quite a bit further. If the world consumed and produced as much as the average Canadian, it would take 7 Earths to regenerate the resources and assimilate the pollution. That's how massively out of whack our country is, and that just gives a indication of how far we need to go. All right, so um, how exactly is the Capitalism Can't Be Fixed platform related to degrowth? Okay, back here. Um, so one of the first sets of proposals in the platform is to bring all significant economic assets under public ownership. And the platform goes on to specify that this would include energy, telecommunications, banking and finance, industrial agriculture, mail, and parcels. Maybe one thing just to note is that in Canada, finance and so-called energy or fossil fuel are deeply interconnected. For example, the Royal Bank of Canada, which is the biggest bank in the country, is the top holder of stock in Enbridge, which is the largest pipeline company in North America. But perhaps under public ownership, we could break that kind of link. Um, but one thing that I guess the first part of my argument is that because public ownership is so much more efficient than private ownership of these major economic sectors, this will actually degrow the Canadian economy all by itself. And I estimate by 7.5%, while improving what we get from these sectors. Now, how did I come up with that exact estimate? I based it on the fact that Canadians spend about half as much per capita as Americans on healthcare, and they get better results. So we have it's not as public, it's not as good as it should be, but compared to the US, it's much better. And we basically have a public system of public health care, and it's cut our expense in half with getting better results. And I just applied that ratio to the economic sectors in the platform: energy, telecommunications, banking, and finance. And if you crunch the numbers there, you get an estimate that, it could actually shrink the Canadian economy by 7.5% while actually improving what we get from those services. Another very inspiring and important plank in the platform that a previous webinar focused on is has to do with housing, and that is converting REITs, real estate investment trusts, into housing co-ops. And this and other measures to get the massive inflation of rent under control will reduce the pressure on so many people to overwork, right? So when rent is so high, you got to, work even harder, add a second job, et cetera. And this idea of allowing people to choose to work less is also in the platform in its own right, I think, as it should be. And there are other planks that address labor rights, converting capitalist firms to cooperatives, and then explicitly having a shorter work week. And if you look across the world and apply different measures of how much power workers have, like percent of the workforce that's unionized, it actually is pretty reliably correlated with working shorter hours. So where workers have more power, they work shorter hours. And one example that I might offer in that respect is Germany, where by law, every company above a certain size has to have half of its board elected by the workers. So it's not a co-op. It hasn't gone all the way there, but it's kind of halfway to being a co-op. And Germany has some of the um, lowest working hours in the world. Okay, so yeah, so that's how I came up with that idea. And yeah, so these other aspects, these other planks in the platform, labor rights, co-op conversions, and shorter work week, would lead to further degrowth beyond that 7.5% from the first set of proposals, more leisure time, and greater well-being. And then just moving on to other planks in the platform, making buildings and how we transport ourselves more energy efficient, banning harmful chemicals, providing universal basic services, again, so people don't have to work themselves to the bone just to afford, basic things that they need. Um, Land back and resource sovereignty would put a brake on the massively exploitative, kind of overgrowth of our resource sector, solving social problems instead of just putting band-aids on them, defunding the military, and finally expropriating billionaires' property without compensation. I would argue that all the above would also degrow the economy while promoting the good of humans, our fellow species, and the biosphere. So that's I guess that's the general uh, case that I would make to pitch the idea that um, Canada needs degrowth, and whatever language is used to make that point, it should be a prominent part of an eco-socialist transformation that we need. And then I'm just going to mention a couple of more specific sectors that are also key to, you know, making this happen. And one of them is the tar sands. So um, this is another inspiring plank in the Capitalism Can't Be Fixed platform. And I would argue that it is really key to Canadian degrowth. The tar sands industry dominates the Canadian economy in biophysical terms. So if we just look at the sheer tonnage of uh, crops being harvested, metal being mined, trees being felled, etc., a third of all that raw material is being just ripped out of the ground in Alberta. And it actually takes 14 times as much material to produce a barrel of oil in Alberta than it does, let's say, in the North Sea or Algeria or other places that that Canada has, that at least Quebec has gotten its oil in the past.
Son of a bitch.
Yeah. Um, and I would argue that it also dominates Canadian politics, seems to have captured the three main parties, including the NDP unfortunately, and that's why it's such an important project to change that about the NDP. And its expansion, and it's expanding explosively, is the worst kind of economic growth. You have maximal environmental impact with minimal benefits. And this, I think, is a really important point to be made, and it connects with what Jasmine was saying at the beginning about jobs. When you grow the fossil fuel sector, and especially the extraction of fossil fuel, you're actually getting 8 times fewer jobs per amount of economic activity as in the rest of the economy. Um, so the expansion of the tar sands is the worst kind of growth. Conversely, it's when we shut it down, it'll be the best kind of degrowth. It's maybe the top priority in terms of sectors to degrow. And I think that this abysmal uh, ability to create jobs is precisely why the ruling class doubles down so fiercely on oil and gas, because they get to keep so much more of the revenue than in other sectors. They don't have nearly as many workers to pay. And on the flip side, it would be relatively easy to transition so few workers to what the platform calls for. Another thing that the platform calls for, which is guaranteed jobs in ecological restoration, renewable energy infrastructure, public transit expansion, and climate adaptation projects. And finally, in terms of shutting down the tar sands, I will make a pitch for the importance of phasing out some of our older pipelines, and in particular, the ones that bring oil from the tar sands all the way to Montreal. And that pathway starts in Alberta, and then makes its way actually through the United States, which is another reason to you shut these things down, and then ends up in Montreal. So the part in the U.S. is called Line 5, and then from Sarnia, Ontario to Montreal, it's called Line 9. Um, Now, Quebec, laudably, has banned all fossil fuel extraction in the province forevermore. And this is pretty amazing because activists got the Legault government to do this, despite the fact that they're not renowned for their environmentalism or their social progressivism, etc. Um, and yet, since 2015, Quebec has been importing tar sands oil from Alberta. That's when Line 9 got reversed to carry tar sands oil here instead of what it had been doing before, which is taking oil which had been shipped to Quebec from less destructive sources, much less destructive sources. Then it was refined in Quebec and shipped westward to be distributed and and sold. It's better and sold, etc. So despite this, kind of very, very important step of banning all fossil fuel extraction in the province, Quebec has been complicit in the explosive growth of the tar sands industry since 2015, since Line 9 got reversed. Um, and it, some comrades and I have been looking into it, and it turns out that it would be pretty easy to switch back to those less destructive sources where Quebec got its oil in the past. And of course, it's necessary to also reduce consumption and exports. So this is my last substantive slide. I'm going to move to a kind of summary of where I've been and then invite people to ask questions, and basically we'll start a discussion. But I'll just say at the moment that if anybody's interested in this project of getting these pipelines shut down, please let me know. There's an inspiring campaign in Montreal called Le Vivant se défend. Life defends itself. And our actions in this campaign range from lobbying different levels of government to actually physically disrupting the flow of oil via mass public demonstrations, which has been done several times now. Um, so that's one campaign that, you know, I would very much welcome people to learn more about and join if interested. And then another opportunity is to collaborate with activists in Ontario, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And the focus there is more on on that upstream pipeline of Line 5. And there's a group called the Cross-Border Organizing Working Group that would also welcome more participation from folks in Canada. So just to review, I offered a couple of generalities based on, crunching numbers and looking across countries and decades, as well as provinces and decades. And that is that economic growth for a long time has been linked to ecological decline. And more recently, it has actually started impeding progress in human well-being. So, health statistics generally over the past century or so have been, improving in most places and times, but it's now negatively associated with economic growth. We looked at a couple of examples where, uh, one member of a pair, either of countries or provinces, had slower growth but faster progress when it comes to things that are important. Um, I made a couple of arguments that planks in the capitalism can't be fixed platform already imply quite a bit of degrowth. And then I talked about the importance of shutting down the tar sands for degrowth, and in turn, the importance of stopping or phasing out these pipelines as a key to shutting down the tar sands. So that's my pitch. And yeah, I would welcome questions, comments, and maybe more about the discussions that Jasmine was referring to earlier that have already taken place on this. And Jasmine, do you want to call on people?
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah, thank you so much for all of that. I mean, also to link it to our platform is really, really valuable for everyone on this call. For me, also to know which parts of the platform that you agree with and that you see it with. Um, so I see we have a bunch of questions, so that's great. I also have some questions of myself, so I'll put myself on the list after Hans, but we'll start with Peter.
Excellent.
Okay, thank you for that. And I just would like to begin by talking about the whole notion of metabolic rift. The notion of degrowth is already present in Marx through uh, what generally gets characterized as his metabolic rift theory by people like John Bellamy Foster, who is the editor of a monthly review. And earlier on in the presentation, reference was made to the way in which the capitalist mode of production essentially squanders the natural resources that it has access to in its production process, in its mode of production. And when Marx talks about the relationship between different modes of production in nature, he talks about the appropriation of nature by indigenous peoples as opposed to the appropriation of nature by other modes of production, such as capitalism, and what indigenous modes of production do. And Marx talks about this later in his career through his correspondence and his notes on Morgan and other indigenous studies, his indigenous studies into the Russian Mir and indigenous studies in Algeria and focusing on India. He does talk about the way in which those indigenous societies in appropriating nature as what he refers to as a free gift, restore uh, elements back to the ecosystem and allow it to recuperate from the process of interacting with it. And whereas capitalism does not do that, capitalism takes that free gift and squanders elements of it and produces, for example, epidemics or extreme periods of drought or famine or what have you. So the metabolic rift. So in that case, I would say that the land back provisions that are made within the document that was produced, those land back provisions in honoring the way in which indigenous people relate to the world also is another way in which the platform participates in this whole notion of degrowth. So I just, you didn't mention the land back provisions within the document itself. So I thought I would bring that to the fore. And if people would have some patience with me, I can point to a paragraph or two by John Bellamy Foster in which he talks about planned degrowth through what he refers to as Marx's theory of metabolic rift. So if you'll permit me, and I'll try, and not to be too long-winded, the metabolic rift itself was explained in terms of the break in the soil nutrient cycle. This is in Marx, and thus the soil metabolism brought on by the shipment of food and fiber hundreds and thousands of miles to the new industrial cities of capitalism, where the population increasingly resided. The soil nutrients in the food and fiber polluted the cities rather than returning to the soil. This led to what Marx in Capital called, and this is from Capital, the irreparable rift in the interdependent process of social metabolism. Marx's ecological analysis, uh, in fact, relied on three concepts: the universal metabolism of nature, the social metabolism, and the metabolic rift. The social metabolism was the labor and production process itself, looked at from the standpoint of its natural reproductive aspects. The alienated social metabolism of capitalism came into direct conflict with the universal metabolism of nature, giving rise to a metabolic rift. Uh, the one document in the socialist literature that I guess best exemplifies this is Engels' The Condition of the Working Class in England, where he talks about epidemics as having been produced by this metabolic rift. And
Sorry, Peter, I'll have to interrupt you there just because we do have a lot of questions to go
right,
through. But
right. But I just wanted to point out how, as a socialist document, the 45-page platform, in alluding to Marx as its inspiration, already contains degrowth within it. That's why you find all of those elements within the document. And one final note, I think the use of the term degrowth is useful. Language is important, and I think given the culture, the kind of technological fetish that people have within the culture in North America and Europe, in which they think that only a technological fix will address the current crisis, and that they don't have to deaccumulate or downgrade their levels of consumption. I think the shock value of using the notion of degrowth is useful in driving that point home, and that people within North America and within Western Europe have to make a conscious effort in which to degrow. All right, so I think the use of the term degrowth is crucial for that. I thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Peter.
did you want to respond at all, Greg?
Um, Maybe just briefly, I did mention land back, but you can be forgiven for not noticing because it was, in a list of a whole bunch of other things, and it wasn't one of the things that I focused specifically on. And I completely agree that it is a crucial part of the whole thing. And I also thank Peter for reinforcing the idea that socialism and degrowth can go very naturally together. And there are, many different scholars, including Bellamy Foster, whom Peter mentioned, but also Jason Hickel and quite a few others working in Europe who have made that strong link between eco-socialism and degrowth. So thanks for doing more of that.
Thank you. I'll just ask if you don't mind stopping your screen share. I think people just want to be able to see
Oh
everyone.
yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Good.
Next we'll do Douglas. I just asked you to, or sorry, no, sorry, Larry. I didn't see you there. Larry, if you're there, I've asked you to unmute. Yeah,
Oh, yeah, I just had a question. Are the slides from this going to be shared?
I'd be happy to send them to be
yeah,
distributed.
great. Then yeah, we can share them.
Thank you.
And then now it's you, Douglas.
Sure, great. So wonderful points that were brought up, and the diagrams are really helpful. What I'd like to focus on is actually because I've worked and lived in cooperatives and worked in unions, worked in nonprofits for about 55 years. And so actually, as the natural food cooperative networks of British Columbia and Quebec were failing, there was an Indigenous economy study group, which goes back to what Peter was saying, and that these Indigenous systems can make us far richer working with nature. And so cooperatives fail because they don't recognize people, whereas the Indigenous system is participatory, recognizing each stakeholder. And actually, the word cooperative comes from co, meaning together. Operatives means stakeholders, but never in the history of modern colonial cooperatives have stakeholders been able to work together. Not in Quebec, even when we have legislation for it. So it's about the accounting recognition of each stakeholder. And also to go on to energy, if we look at the fecal matter that Montreal's 2 million people flush down the river every day, and I've worked in pollution control, I've worked in pollution purification stations, and they don't work. So, but all of this fecal energy in methane and fertilizer is enormous in energy. So is the wind concentrated on our buildings, the solar concentrated in our buildings, and just capturing the energy that's destroying our urban infrastructure will give us enough energy to export to all of the communities that surround us. We have enough to meet our needs and export. So, and Quebec's, I go back to 1968, 69 in solidarity with the Cree on the James Bay damming. And we have destroyed the livelihoods of those people and put in actually depreciating we've lowered the rainfall and snowfall of northern Quebec by 40% because of those things. So anyways, and Karl Marx, again, last point, yes, his later writings, such as Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State, excellent, as Peter was saying. So the early Karl Marx writings are very different from the later, and Frederick Engels as well. I want to reinforce wonderful presentations that people have made. Thank you. Thank you here, Greg.
So thank you, Douglas. Also a lot of interesting and important information there. Just to follow up on one point that you made, and that is the reduced precipitation. One fact that I just find appalling is that as extraction in the tar sands has been exploding, mostly for export, as fracking for gas in places where we should be doing wind, like Peace River Valley in BC, is exploding. I guess it's not mostly for export yet, but that's the intent. Renewable energy generation in Canada has actually declined since 2015. We're supposed to be undergoing a transition, and yet we're exploding fossil fuel, and we've actually declined in renewable energy generation. Now, why is that? Part of it is precisely for the reason that you identified, and that is some of our rivers are just not, they just don't have as much water in them. And so they're not generating as much electricity. This is definitely the case for Quebec, where hydro generation has declined, I think, for the last 3 years. I'm just reading the latest État de l'énergie dans Quebec. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Hans, we'll go next.
Well, thank you for an excellent, thoughtful presentation. In my lifetime, humanity has exploded by 50% from 6 billion to 9 billion. And when we talk about universal social services, let's just call it bluntly, what would happen if the majority of the world's population that do not now have a pension, if they had a pension? I submit that the population growth would stop. That pension could be paid for by socialization of wealth, i.e., socialism. Feminism would liberate women from becoming um, wombs primarily, and secularization would remove the religious impetus for the hierarchical male dominance and reproductive factors. So my basic question is, socialism would automatically lead to socialism on a world planet would lead to a depopulation, a population limitation of our extraordinary growth. And other factors surely would automatically kick in that are not necessarily as benign as an old age pension, i.e., the erosion of the productivity of our land thanks to huge scale and industrial agriculture, which has no regard for the health of the land, the productivity of the biological resources. Could you address some of those factors as well, please?
Well, I very much agree that providing income security in old age will help to alleviate the pressure to have, more kids. That's I think that's definitely part of why population has increased so much. In my talk, all of my stats were about per capita consumption, per capita wealth, per capita health, et cetera. But population certainly is an equally important driver of ecological destruction. Um, and I guess just generally, I would agree that making life better for people is going to go along with reducing the pressure to um, keep growing the number of people. But I guess one important point is that unless there's a disaster, we don't want population to come down precipitously, right? We want it to ease down for the right reasons, because people are having fewer children, not to come down because a lot more people are dying early. And that means it's a much longer term project than consumption, uh, where in the case of, let's say, overly rich countries, and especially overly rich classes within those countries, like the billionaires, we can dramatically reduce that per capita consumption a lot faster, and a lot more, let's say, beneficially than we could bring population down fast. So they're equally important ecologically, but since we don't want to have any of the changes be by, you know, complete catastrophe, um, bringing down the consumption side of the picture um, is going to be it's a more short-term kind of proposition. But thank you for raising those issues.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask my questions now because I put myself on the list after Hans. Um, so I have three, so you can decide how to do it. Two of them are more so about how you present your argument, which like is not measuring by GDP like just fallible because considering like the financialization of the economy, like isn't that just inviting criticism, I guess? Like wouldn't something like I don't know, isn't there like wouldn't there be a more accurate way of measuring it? And then also I guess like when in your talk you say, you know, Canadians consume and I find that problematic, I guess, because is it Canadians or is it, you know, the ruling class, which could be even Americans who own our oil and gas sector? So, I mean, like, is it really Canadians consuming that's the problem, or is it our oil and gas sector? And then my third question is about China's ecological civilization, um, I don't know, theory, state theory that they have. And I guess like what your perspective is on that.
Okay, I'll work backward. I believe China actually passed a law in 2019 or something like that that commits it to becoming an ecological civilization. I have to admit, I don't know that much about China. I hope they're serious about it. And I hope that, I mean, some important changes have already taken place in China. They have brought air pollution way down from the terrible condition that, the terrible state that it was in 10, 20 years ago. But their overall consumption of raw materials and production of greenhouse gases and things like that has still not come down. So I have a friend who has been to China several times. He's a climate physicist actually, and he always comes back very impressed with the leaps and bounds that they're making there with their technology, which they're not just using themselves but making available to places like Pakistan to take up. So apparently Pakistan has taken up solar power being supplied by China in a big way. Um, but yeah, so I think there are a lot of positive signs there, but I probably because China is so focused on economic growth, it's still unclear whether they're going to be the kind of ecological savior that they could and should be. Maybe that's one way to sum up my general take. Again, I'm not a China expert. Um, and yeah, I guess when we talk about the need for Canada to degrow, using average figures is I think appropriate to compare us to the rest of the world. But of course, within Canada, we need to start by expropriating those billionaires' wealth, like you guys say toward the end of the platform, um, and and that can be done basically with no cost whatsoever to human well-being. In fact, it would be a boon to to basically just destroy, let's say, tax away, and then just you know destroy all that wealth would actually do far more good than leaving it in the hands of the people who are increasingly controlling our lives, in surveilling us constantly, um, doubling down on fossil fuel to now power their data centers. That pathological aspect of this stage of capitalism has gone a bit further in the US, but it's definitely coming here as well. There's going to be pressure to, keep pumping out more and more fossil fuel so we can build bigger and bigger data centers so we can be spied on even more. And yeah, we have to. So yeah, and more generally, ecological economists have argued for decades, going all the way back to people like Herman Daly in the early 1970s, that as soon as you stop growing the economy, you can no longer use growth as an excuse to ignore equality. So, actually, it goes even further back than that. I think it was John F. Kennedy, who was the first president, who said, "A rising tide lifts all boats. So let's not worry about, how it's distributed because everybody's going to be better off." Well, as soon as you admit that we have to stop that growth so we don't destroy the planet that we live on, then you have to get much more serious about distribution. So I don't know if that directly addresses the question that you had about talking about Canadians in general, but yeah, of course there are massive disparities, and as we degrow, if we do it, through things like the capitalism can't be fixed platform, we will be redistributing much more profoundly, and maybe most of the Canadian population could actually, well, at least there are various societies where you could degrow the whole economy and still have most of the population end up richer because the distribution is so much better. And then finally, going back to GDP, GDP is I'm basically saying that GDP growth is bad. So I agree that it's not a suitable measure of what we want or anything good. I think it is still important to pay attention to, because GDP is precisely what the ruling class is fixated on growing, because it is fairly reliably correlated with level of profit. So I don't know if
Yeah.
that starts answering your question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay.
Barry, if you wanted to go next.
Yeah, thank you very much, Greg, for a very illuminating presentation. Your colorful examples are very helpful in terms of, setting our sights for how we want to explain humanistic goals for which the socialist movement stands. I think a lot of the reason that prompts degrowth is underlaying it is, of course, economic insecurity. We can address that issue. We can find solutions to many of our problems pretty quickly. I just want to draw attention to three issues within the framework of your presentation. You touched on them, but you might want to elaborate. One is advertising, another is over-packaging, and the third is military spending. So very briefly on each. Advertising. Advertising is a multi-billion-dollar industry that produces nothing except false consciousness. I know that's a bit of an exaggeration, but there was a program, a television series, which I watched. I enjoyed it. It's called Mad Men. And it's not just a pun on Madison Avenue. It's also about the madness of advertising, the creation of false needs. And I think of one kind of silly example. I'm sure there are many, many more. Toilet paper. There's a particular firm or set of companies that are marketing toilet paper that tears along a wave rather than along a straight line, because it might be jagged. It might not tear evenly. Talk about the creation of false needs. Really. Secondly, over-packaging. This has been much talked about since I grew up in the 60s and was surrounded, by people who said, why do we have to have 3 and 4 layers of plastic between us and the thing that we're attempting to utilize? So there's an enormous amount of over-packaging, and that's a profitable industry in and of itself. We could well do without it. finally, military spending. What we need is firefighters, rescue and relief operations, and not weapons of mass destruction, which are extremely expensive and are incapable of housing anyone. They're capable of destroying many housing and infrastructure, and we're seeing that tragically in Iran this very minute. If you care to comment on advertising, overpackaging, and military spending, I'm sure we'll all enjoy what you have to say.
Well, thank you, Barry. I enjoyed what you had to say on it. Maybe on military, I'll just a little bit tongue-in-cheek offer a slogan, and that is, you know, a few years ago, it was pretty popular to call for defunding the police. And then some writers picked up on that and said, okay, well, while we're at it, let's defund the military. So defund the police, defund the military, and hey, let's defund the economy. That's what I'm basically saying tonight. Not completely. We do need an economy, but defund the police, defund the military, defund the economy. So I think maybe what you're doing is getting at an important point, and that is just as, you know, growing the economy indiscriminately doesn't reliably really benefit maybe anybody anymore. Likewise, degrowing the economy indiscriminately would not be nearly as effective as targeting particular sectors. So I talked about the tar sands industry and pipelines. You're identifying other, you know, absolutely prime candidates, military spending, you know, packaged, well, the packaging industry, and yes, of course, advertising. And I'm actually not sure exactly what the situation is on advertising in Canada. I'm from the US originally. I've been here for a long time, but this is one detail that I haven't learned about Canada. But at least in the US, in most places, companies can actually get a tax deduction for everything they spend on advertising. And many decades ago, again, Herman Daly said we should not be giving a tax deduction for advertising. Instead, we should be taxing it as a form of pollution. Okay, so let's completely the opposite. I guess somebody is unmuted, but yeah, I think in general what you're doing is is pointing out that there are particular sectors that we need that are kind of at the top of the list for for degrowing.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to ask how much time you have. Did you have time to take like 3 more questions, or should we cut it off here?
It's up to you all. I'm you know, this is important to me, and I appreciate the interest. So I'd be happy to keep going.
Great, that's perfect. We'll do Emily next.
Oh, thank you. I've had so many thoughts with all the other speakers that my mind is about to explode. I'm so fortunate because I'm going to Spain this week. My granddaughter is doing her master's degree in degrowth in Barcelona. And I've been trying to keep up with the readings that she sent me. And some of the things that emerged as I do the readings and pretend that I'm doing her degree with her is that degrowth is now my vision is that I'd like to get our speakers' comments on that. It's not an issue for the global south. It's just an issue for the global north. That's one of the points I'd like to make. The other thing is that degrowth, just as feminism, equality for now, anti-racism, the old-fashioned environmentalism when I was doing my graduate program 40 years ago, you know, it's the terms are used across the perspective from capitalism to socialism. So, for example, you know, nationalization of industry and a degrowth platform is different from acknowledging that, well, the way we're going to do this is via capitalism and supporting capitalism. So, you know, the concepts can be applied across the political perspective is one of the things I wanted to make. And I forget, I made a little note here and I can't remember it. And oh, the other thing is that I find is better than when I was doing a program, as I said, 40 years ago in environmental design, that now certainly there's a better integration in the literature of the physical environment, social environment, political environment. And hence, yes, the students are reading Marxism and Trotskyism, and they're reading current but the contemporary, more contemporary writers from the 70s on social limits to growth. And so I really think that it's a very rich intellectual environment now, and potentially for social activism too, because it crosses technology, the physical environment, social, how we're organized socially, etc. So all of those things together. And then, of course, on that spectrum of privatization versus nationalization of industry, which takes us back to the spectrum. So I'll stop there because I could go on for a long time and I won't.
Well, thank you, and good for your daughter for getting a master's in Barcelona.
Granddaughter.
Oh, granddaughter, sorry. Uh,
I'm
I
old.
went to a degrowth conference at that institute that I mentioned this past summer, the Degrowth Institute in Chicago, and there were a ton of people who had gotten their masters at that Barcelona program. And one thing that I was interested in is, at a degrowth conference, is how people first kind of got sold on the idea. And almost everybody that I asked mentioned a particular book that was written by a professor who's now working at Barcelona, and that is Less is More
Yeah.
by Jason
Yes.
Hickel.
Echo. Yeah.
I was already a degrowther by the time I encountered Hickel's work, but I agree it's a fantastic book, and it's very inspiring. I also noticed on the second reading, because I managed to convince some other folks in a reading group to go through it with me. I was reminded just how rigorously he grounds just about everything he says in really current, cutting edge history, science, etc. So that's great that your granddaughter's able to do that. And yeah, I have heard about and encountered just a few times the idea of degrowth or steady state or economic shrinkage on the right part of the spectrum. But it does seem to me, and I have been convinced by people who have argued that capitalism is actually fundamentally incompatible with degrowth, because if the economy is not growing, you're just not going to convince enough rich people to keep throwing their money into the stock market, which a capitalist economy requires. I mean, not whether it's the stock market or other kinds of investment. So even if the rhetoric can be found, across a certain swath of the political spectrum, I've been convinced that degrowth would actually be incompatible with capitalism.
Yeah. And I just want to point out that but the literature is there, just as there is with anti-racism and feminism, that to say the literature on the right to say that it's very compatible. We can have gender equality and we can have an anti-racist society in a capitalist economy, right?
Oh, right.
So,
okay.
yeah.
Gotcha.
So see what I mean? Like, so similarly in degrowth, they can say, well, yeah, we can we don't have to be socialist and nationalize industries. We can there can be a private sector that can be degrowth, just as the rhetoric too on environmentalism now that cap and so on and so forth. So that's alive and well. And certainly having existed all these years and been involved in the women's movement, the environmental movement, the anti-apartheid movement, and so on and so forth, that you come to recognize how quickly it can be co-opted, right? Just a point that I'm making, co-opted in the literature, and then popularly as well, that feminism has been commodified and with capitalism. And so degrowth can be commodified as well. So just pointing that out, which scares me, right? Because
I think it might be a little tougher to commodify degrowth.
I hope so. I vote for you.
Thank you. Bianca?
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Greg, for your presentation. It's amazing that you were able to link it to capitalism can't be fixed as well. Just totally riveting stuff. Most of my questions that I was going to ask have already been answered. I did, Emily did bring up that degrowth is usually framed as something that needs to happen in the global north. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that, on the relationship between degrowth in wealthy countries and the development needs or aspirations of the global south. And then in terms of like kind of real world movement building, degrowth clearly makes all the sense in the world ecologically, but we are operate like even in our campaign where there's some of the finest, most radical minds. We're told that prosperity means economic growth. And so I'm just wondering, you talked about Jason Hickel, that was really useful, but I'm just wondering, like, what have you seen work in terms of frameworks for talking about this for people who, or critics who say that it's a politics of sacrificing, just it's sacrifice and you can't sell that. And, it's austerity. It's like, what's the positive vision that makes people excited about it rather than fearful, thinking about just how to convince people that this can actually improve their lives?
Yeah, great question. I definitely think that Hickel, does some of that pretty well. Also, his colleague in Barcelona, Gregory Callis, and the way that they frame it is, we need to think about kind of public wealth, public abundance, publicly provided abundance, so that we don't need to be striving and competing to just accumulate on a private level. And Callis actually devotes an entire book to it. It's a little bit esoteric, in terms of the argumentation, but it's a critique of Malthus, who, is kind of an arch capitalist and, basically emphasized the idea of scarcity. So, yeah, we can all have like wonderful, full, time rich. Actually, that's another concept that I would want to emphasize as well, because in the research that I've done, if we look at different things that go into GDP, of course, there's population, there's productivity, which is the amount of GDP being generated per hour worked. And then there's the employment rate, what percentage of your population is employed. But of all those, I actually found that working hours had a stronger connection to ecological destruction if working hours are high, or reduced ecological destruction. Reduced ecological destruction. And to me, the idea here is, okay, what if you could tell people next year, instead of getting certain percentage raise, so you can go out and buy more stuff, what if you got another week off? And then what if the year after that you got another week off? And then another and another. And this goes back to the fact that I mentioned, and that is when workers actually do have more power, they work less. And therefore the economy grows less, because the amount of work that people have to do is one of the fundamental determinants of the overall size of the economy. So to me, the idea of a society and people being time rich and having the time to cultivate hobbies and spend time with their loved ones, etc., to me that can be like tremendously inspiring. But yeah, I would point to Callis, Kallis, and Jason Hickel for additional kind of perspectives on how to talk about that. And I think you had another question, right?
Yeah, I just wanted to hear more about the relationship of degrowth to the global south. And maybe it's just too big of a question, but
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear about that.
Yeah. Well, it is so almost all degrowth advocates say degrowth is for overdeveloped countries. Okay. It's for, Canada, the US, Europe, Australia, et cetera. It's not for countries that have much lower GDP per capita because they, in many cases, actually need to grow to get to the point where they, are flourishing in ways that we want all humans on Earth to be able to flourish. And I think that's an essential point. Somebody from the Global South this summer at this degrowth conference put it a different way, and that is you in the global north need to degrow so that you can de-link from us and just leave us alone. Quit messing with us, quit devouring our resources. If you look at, where resources flow, they're being, Canada is a bit of an exception because Canada is very resource heavy, but if you look at Europe, they're devouring resources from Africa and South America, et cetera. And so rich countries need to degrow so that they don't have to, because if they want to keep on growing, they have to keep exploiting the heck out of the global south. So I think all those are good points, and we need to let the global south kind of chart their own course. Interestingly, though, when I look at when I do statistical analyses of relationships between economic growth and measures of well-being, I talked about one of the most basic tonight, and that is life expectancy. But there are other measures like healthy life expectancy, which takes into account, the prevalence and severity of different injuries and diseases and things like that. I actually find that economic growth is, as it's currently happening in the global south, is not doing them any good either. And I haven't looked into it deeply, but I might speculate that it's precisely because so much economic growth in the global south is now not really benefiting the people there. It's benefiting, the dominant countries. So, presumably, when and if rich countries do de-link and stop exploiting poor countries, economic growth will come to benefit those poor countries more because it'll be directed toward their own ends rather than being subverted. So anyway, those are a few things to say on that issue.
Thank you. And then the last question, B. Santu.
Oh, hi, thank you very much. I have a question, and it's based a little bit on my own personal experience. I worked for the government of British Columbia in the 1990s, and we actually had a minister responsible for cooperatives. And guess what? I was her senior executive. And we did a lot. There was a lot of discussions on, particularly her focus was on clear political direction, on all the kind of things that you're talking about. And it was on worker co-ops, which brought in all these elements, right? And one of the things that and there was no I can tell you with a strong kind of right-wing opposition politically and so forth, there was absolutely no pushback on that this was not the right thing to do. In fact, it was seen as very positive because this is all sort of taking humans to the sort of the highest vision possible for their well-being. The problem that started to happen was when we got stuck in the transition strategy, right? So yes, capitalism cannot be fixed, but in order to get rid of it, there has to be a transition. And I can tell you, I don't know how many worker co-ops I helped start. Sooner or later, you would run into just the basics of access to capital, right? For growth of the business. Basic things on just sort of the formation of the board, hiring of specialists who ended up coming from private industry and so forth with all the, measure this and measure that type of stuff. And so my question would you to be is that, have you thought about, or do you have any ideas, not in terms of what the end goal should be, which I don't think you'll find anybody disagreeing with you, but how do we get there? And in fact, the case of China is also a bunch of red flags, because China did go through a very messy period before now they can say that they are, kings of solar power, but they were also the, amongst the biggest polluters and so forth. And a lot of that they've moved down to Vietnam, Philippines, etc. So how just focus on that, is that convincing people is not an issue. I think people generally they love the idea. It resonates. But what structural method system do we need outside of just simple tax the rich stuff, but in terms of more organizational to transition towards that? Because that's where I find most of these great ideas fail, in the transitioning part. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Sandhu. I very much agree that access to capital is maybe the key. Access to capital and a few other kind of technical logistical things is the key impediment to having a cooperative commonwealth, and it goes that the problem goes way back. Already in the mid 19th century, John Stuart Mill, who was actually the most prominent economist of his time, he thought that cooperatives were such a better way to organize business and the economy, and so much better for their workers, so much better for society. He thought that they would just naturally take over. But surprise, surprise, people with money, people with too much money, aren't generally interested in investing in businesses where they don't get to control things. And that's what a cooperative is, because a cooperative is controlled by its workers, not by the provider of capital. And so that's been the key. So it's absolutely essential. So public investment is absolutely essential. And I think the idea of public investment is kind of shot through the Capitalism Can't Be Fixed platform, and it's also going to be key to helping new cooperatives form, also providing incentives for capitalist firms to convert into cooperatives. I mean, you can get businesses switching both ways. Unfortunately, Mountain Equipment Co-op, which I used to buy my outdoor gear from, flipped from being a consumer co-op to a corporation. I haven't been back since, but sometimes things go the other way as well. But it is absolutely key to have democratic control, not only of within the business, but you have to have a fair bit of democratic control of the economy so that you can funnel capital and other prerequisites to cooperatives and help them flourish, because they're just not going to flourish in a capitalist economy.
Thank you. We'll just take, I guess, this last 5 minutes because we have one question in the chat. Says, aren't our pension funds based on growth? So how will degrowth impact pension funds?
Yes, that is a great question. I think it's going to negatively affect pension funds, but if degrowth is done through something like the Capitalism Can't Be Fixed platform, which involves, publicly providing services that you now have to pay through the nose for, it's going to be okay that you don't have that massive amount of money that all your financial advisors say you have to have before you can retire, because society is going to provide those things to a much greater extent. So I think it's unavoidable that socialism and degrowth are going to negatively affect capitalism, and unfortunately, our pensions are fundamentally tied to capitalism. So, but I think it'll be a sacrifice worth making, because we'll be benefiting in so many other ways that it'll make up for not having that massive nest egg that everybody says we need to have.
Yeah, thank you. Lucy, did you have a last question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, it's just a comment. Thank you for this beautiful evening. Thank you. It's
Thank you.
it feels so good in these times to be among, what's the expression? Kindred spirits. I hope that's the right expression. Some years ago, my career brought me to Germany. I'm an opera singer by trade, and I went to Germany. And I guess I got curious about the sociology, although I'm not a sociologist, but and I was told that coming out of the war, there were some real problems that went from unequal wages and lack of work for some people, unfortunately, and too much work for other people. Health was down. Germans were becoming bigger or as big as Americans and as unhealthy as Americans. And they just got together mainly with community groups that pushed for certain measures. And when I lived there from 2010 from 2003 to 2010, a new employee in a firm would get the first year 28 days off. 28 days off. I think that rolls off the tongue, and we can use that again and just push for getting more off time. And that's in the Gegenheit von capitalism. It's the opposite of capitalism because we're told work, 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 and that's not the solution. The solution is by working on public health, and getting 28 days off is public health. The most you can get is 2 months off when you've been working at the bank for 37 years, but it's more balanced. Here you start, if you're lucky, you get a week off per year worked. I'm self-employed. I don't get holidays, but it is possible. And now Germans are healthier, they're slimmer, and they're more rested because they get more off time. And also, there was a statistic that came out when I lived there. I don't remember who put it out, but compared median income in Germany with the US, Germans earned about $10,000 a year less than the median in North America, but that did not make their lifestyles worse. It made it way, way, way better. Sure, they all go to Mallorca for holidays, and but more and more they're starting to explore their own country and to go to countries that you can reach by train and stuff like that. So the best bike paths are now in Germany. It's like, the people got together and said, okay, we're going to do this and that and this and that. It helped that they were rebuilding their country and getting a new constitution. But I guess the volume, capitalism cannot be fixed, is a great basis for a constitution. I'll stop there because I can't shut up about my time over there. But yeah, and thank you once again. This was brilliant.
Well, thank you all. I really appreciate the interest and the questions and the comments. Maybe just one thing about Germany. It is a very interesting and important case. But I guess we have to be eternally vigilant. I saw a headline a few weeks ago about how the current government now wants to make people start to work more hours again. They said, this isn't working so well for our capitalist ambitions, we have to, you know, you guys have to stop slacking so much, and we have to insist on our right to slack, or as Bertrand Russell put it, he wrote an essay called "In Praise of Idleness" in 1932, which is another way to put it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for this presentation. I think everybody really appreciated it and just how tailored to us it was. So yeah, thank you so much for that. And if you don't mind sending us the presentation, and maybe if you had any like readings that you think that we might appreciate, we could also circulate those as well because people were asking in the chat. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for your inspiring work.
All right, thanks everybody. We'll see you on Monday for the next volunteer meeting. Okay, bye everyone.